All right, welcome back to part two, everyone. So let's go on and start with. So we finished, talking about telegraph, which was huge. Telegraph, as advertising, scanners, sending mode, and so on. We talked about telephone, common carrier, network neutrality, having, telephone as a landline or like an essential thing. And then we start with film. Okay. All right, so starting with film. Now, it started with, photography. So photography at that time was still developing as same as telegraph. People were enchanted by, the realistic images it produced. The photographic images are considered as a 19th century new media form because many things presented in rapid order and of course with light variation between them, giving, the idea and the illusion of movement. This is when they call it, the persistence of vision. Now, it took enormous initiative and invention by a wide range of people, including Thomas Edison, that we all know, in the United States, and the Lumiere brothers in France. But eventually, the idea of moving picture was perfected. There was a lot of moving picture systems that has been largely praised by digital projection systems. Small frames of film with a still image are projected with strong light behind them into a screen of the front of a viewing room. So just, giving you the idea of what is really film and how it was created. So the effect, to the audience, it was the idea of, the magic of movies. And much of what digital technologies have been seeking to perfect over the past half century is to recreate what was achieved mechanically. And that was the turn of the 20th century. The many frames approach, however, remains the way of achieving the illusion of movement even now. Of course, there's a lot of things that has happened, and right now computers can perform essentially the exact same functions as telegraphs did, but in much more detail and much more quickly. So, the film is little here because again, it's just at that time it was just the idea of moving pictures and putting frames together to perform a moving scene. There was no sound at that time. Now going to radio. Now, as magical as a telephone was, if of course it was nothing compared to a radio. Telephone, it was from point A to point B. So radio gave, a whole new meaning of interaction, but telephone was something else. But again, radio was point A to so many people at once at the same time. So you're creating so many sounds and different voices, and hundreds of people can listen to it at the same time. Now, radio technology brought forth a number of developments that provided extremely important for the internet and the new media. So first we talk about the first, the importance of radio development though. So of course, the number one is the importance of hobbyists, which we'll go to in a few. The identification of new business models, including advertisement, sponsorship, and finally the relation of content. So again, radio gave them something new to work on. It was not just a secret phone call between point A to point B. Now it was messages that was being broadcasted, on a public domain to so many people at once. Of course, there was going to be a lot of regulation. How can they regulate and censor what kind of news are being broadcasted? Now, before World War I, radio was primarily a hobby activity, particularly be popular with, young men. Prior to the 1920s, radio was not broadcasting undertaken. It was so easy. The basic elements of radio transmitter receiver, once the technology was well understood, was relatively inexpensive. So people can buy the equipment of how to make, the radio of transmitter receiver, and it was such an easy thing and people that can play with. Radio pioneer, let me zoom in over here. Radio pioneer Guglielmo Marconi and a few other companies operated radio telegraph stations as, point-to-point communication technology for ships at sea or as an alternative to wire telegraphs in the difficult terrain. Morse code at that time was being used, since only Morse code was being used at that time, radio telegraphy did not have, much widespread of an appeal beyond the use among trained operators for some commercial messages, basically, just used for an advertisement. Nevertheless, there was a dedicated group of amateurs who liked experimenting with radio, and eventually it was among these hobbyists that many of early technical advances were made. Plans circulated especially in hobby magazines, and an important industry of radio parts and skits supplier grew. Basically, people were buying, the actual technology behind building a radio. So the entry level and the more advanced radios could be easily built at home. A Canadian living in the United States, Reginald Fessenden, is credited with sending, the very first spoken words over the radio, playing violin, playing some Christmas carols from a radio, from a record player over the radio. Now, the very beginnings of social media. Now, developments and these early informal social connections were both enabled by the medium and by the topic that members of a group were interested in. So it was a felicitous match. Now we're talking about the content, we're talking about the medium, and we're talking about the message. So radio amateurs could connect with seemingly limitless group of people and without restriction on the time they spent on air. So for example, pretending that I'm on air and I'm talking to you guys right now, and I can spend how much time I want talking about different topics, maybe having an advertisement of soap. So for example, soap opera. The soap opera actually came from the word soap because they had so many advertisements of soap at the time. Advertisements of mobile phones, maybe gas prices, and so on. So they use that time to socialize, to compare notes on equipment, and to learn more about their hobby. But the fact remains that hobbyists help advance radio technology in significant ways. Are we here? Let me just check over here. So yeah, we were talking about development of radio amateurs. Yeah. It was very similar to, people learning about HTML code in the shared and, learning, using the technology to learn about the technology. Hobbies can also be credited with finding the business model that would take radio from being more than a military or point-to-point communication medium, as it was used by the telegraph companies. Here, Frank Conrad, who was a radio amateur from Pennsylvania, who is widely credited with transmitting the first commercial radio broadcast in 1919, playing records provided by a local record store. So, he wanted to even introduce people to different music through this record store. Other ideas, again, how there was, having this market of selling, not just selling radio, but also selling radio receivers. So up until that time, radio technology has been considered only a business tool or the domain of the hobbyists, because again, the audience were the ones who basically made the radio their own. They played around with it. They basically continued to show, content and the idea of, of advertisement. All of those were huge things for radios at that time. So what about rules and regulations about the radio? So one of the oldest, broadcasting station is talking about the commercial content of radio broadcasts. So the commercial content here, we want to understand how it changed the way government regulated the medium. So up until the time of the first radio broadcast, speaking of the 1920s in Canada, government regulation, we are over here, government regulation of radio was very light-handed. Basically, it was very loose. They did not really regulate a public medium such as radio. As commercially sponsored, radio grew quickly through the 1920s and the 1930s to become a huge business. So therefore, the content changed, and in particular, soap operas, just like we mentioned. Named, of course, because of the many soap commercials they carried. That is in page 58, guys. And comedies began to displace, listening to a show. So again, you have like soap operas, you have like sketch comedies and so on. So these things they thought to be like high culture content, such as symphonies or radio plays. Do you guys know what high culture, the definition of high culture? I would like to know more what you guys think is high culture. Now, later on, a Canadian model emerged in which there was a role for both private and public broadcasters, because we don't want to monopolize radio to be only by the government or completely private. Now, because of Canada's huge geographical area, radio offered the potential to further unite the country under one shared identity. This Canadian challenge basically led the federal government to set up the Royal Commission to look into the benefits of nationwide broadcasting system on radio broadcasting. That was one of the very first things that was issued report in 1929. Over here, the Royal Commission on Radio Broadcasting recommending the establishment of a publicly funded radio broadcasting in Canada. So again, this is very, very important for you guys to know, is the establishment of the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, which is the CRBC in 1932. And then so CRBC had the task of being both a national radio broadcasting and a regulating force for the emerging of a private radio industry. Basically, now let's say I want to make a radio on my house. It's very easy. I can buy the waves. I can bring a good microphone, a good application to edit and maybe get some advertisers. So I go to the CRBC and be like, okay, guys, I want to build a small radio program and I want to make a couple of shows and so on. Later on, the Parliament subsequently split those roles and created the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the CBC, to focus on broadcasting, while the CRBC continued to regulate the aspect, eventually becoming the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunication Commission, which is the CRTC. As with, the present day new media, the early days of radio often resulted in calls for regulation because of concerns related to unsuitable material that was concerned national audiences, material that was concerning the government, concerning the military, and so on. Maybe even the influence on children, the impacts on politics, business, and family. So basically, they wanted to make sure that the messages or the content that was broadcasting on radio was suitable for everyone, meaning that it was not, it did not have bad influence on different age criteria. So again, like the politics or bad influence on children, or giving some explicit messages and so on. Now, from early radio broadcasters to commercial radio. Both Westinghouse, that is the Conrad's KDKA station, and Marconi, and we talked about him a few slides ago, the CFCF station in Montreal, were originally interested in broadcasting because they thought it would be a great way to sell radio receivers, and of course it would make more money. They would soon discover, however, that the profit and power were elsewhere. The large corporations, both after Conrad and CFC, such as NBC, CBS, and ABC, all of those, they brought a new approach to the radio business, and advertising has been a mainstay of commercial radio ever since. So advertising was the biggest revenue of radio at the time. Now, going back to compare a little bit, newspaper had for a long time charged a nominal price, for the paper itself. So for example, if I want to put an advertisement, where am I going to put it? So if I want to have a front page, because my product is big, I'm going to pay obviously big amount of money versus papers inside of the newspaper itself, or even at the very back of the newspaper. But in radio, How could you broadcast and charge a subscription fee? How can you sell people, time? Radio did not have that option of, pages, if you want a front page, if you want a back page, if you want a big advertisement, if you want a small advertisement, and so on. So the answer, it seemed, was to embed advertisement. So you would embed it before or after the radio program. So for example, my program starts at 8 a.m. and before my 8 a.m. program, there's a coffee advertisement, to have them like wake up. So either before or after the radio program, such as we're pretty familiar with those these days, or right in the middle of the program, with actors taking time out of the story to, work the product itself into the story, which we call the product placement. I'll give you an example. Guys, when you watch a movie and the two characters are talking, they're having a conversation, and then one of the characters, he goes to the fridge and he just grabs a can of Pepsi to drink it. He does not talk about the Pepsi at all. He just continues the conversation with the other character. But because you see the logo on the screen, that is called a product placement. So this form of embedded advertising persists to this day. So in the advertising that lines Google search pages and in many commercial blogs and news sites, the advertisements that appear within video games. So even in video games, you can have logo of McDonald's or BMW or whatever. And in the pop-ups that appear at the foot of emails. Again, the form of idea we're very last here. Now, thanks to the presidency by radio, there was a huge, incredibly amount of people to get shift back to the subscription model. The subscription model basically would work because online content can be encrypted by a single machine or user and can be delivered without broadcasting it into the world. Subscription model, basically, you're subscribing to, again, Netflix, you're subscribing to Disney Channel. But radio, well, people are not really paying for it. So this is why it says here, let me grab my highlighter. Because of the radio, it has been incredibly difficult to get people, or users, audiences, to shift back to the subscription model. Why do I want to pay for content? Again, we're talking about these back in the 1950s or 60s, or maybe even earlier 40s, maybe. Radio was free to the people and people liked not paying anything. But regular media consumers have to expect, free content, though not content, it's not free of advertising, something that the new media pioneers had to inherit. So radio also achieved something, unprecedented by a mass medium. It took hold of people's attention in the privacy of their homes during their daily routine. There was even smaller radios that you can take it, in your kitchen, in your bedroom. It was car radios and so on. So of course, the influence of radio, however, would soon be eclipsed by something even more powerful, the television. So we have discussed the telegraph's capability to send one single frame image over long distance by scanning, and film's creation of the illusion of movement by showing series of images at high speed. But how can we combine those two innovations? So both telegraphic scanning and filmmaking were difficult. So combining them together made a long series of frustrating experiments, and the challenges involved were not overcome until just before the World War II. Okay. So of course, the very first burst of airwaves, but was in the late 1940s. So yeah, pretty much radio was in the 1920s or 30s. So sorry about the confusion, and was widespread in the 1950s. So although the war put the development of television, between those time, it started to come to Canada on the commercial basis with the start of Montreal CBFT station in 1952. Many hopes that many of the hopes and dreams that people had for the television mirrored the early aspirations held for radio, that it would be a civilizing force for for society. So how can we help them be more civilized? Although commercial radio soon degenerated into an endless stream of advertisements, so anytime, guys, I promise, if you open a radio, if you switch on a radio, it's gonna be endless advertisement. So it largely was lacking the educational content, and that was people was hoping for. So many hoped that the educational potential of television would offset in commercial aspects. Some of the CBC's first television broadcasts were, political events, for example, the opening of the parliament, educational program, and so on. So television mostly followed radio into becoming commercial focused. Are we here? Let me just go. Okay. So the television net again, as an entertainment medium, television dominated the leisure time of people during the late 20th century, even more than the radio did in the 1930s and 40s. So again, very important paragraph, the very first paragraph in page 62. So that is super important, guys. The very first paragraph of page 62, it says here that television followed radio into becoming a commercial focused entertainment medium. So again, there was no minimum amount of information or education dedicated into that medium. Television basically, I feel like I'm missing a few slides over here. No, I think we're fine. Okay, so television networks, with the set schedules based on, target demographics. They require viewers to watch the programs they provide and advertisements to fill in those programs. Now, these networks face the challenge of audience time shifting, whether, audiences are now streaming shows online or creating their own YouTube content. People can now watch when and where they want to watch and what they want to watch at the time they want it. Now, that was not the luxury that we had at the time. So yeah, they were able to strip the annoying advertisements from television. No, but in the 1950s and 1960s, television was very, very powerful, dominating the media landscape in ways that now seem to be, distant from the past. Just to wrap up the idea about, transmitting the television, it had a huge global reach of the telegraph and the telephone by the 1970s, the movement of film and the sound and the private consumptions aspect of radios. In 1987, Canada led the world in the use of broadcasting satellites for the national TV when it was called Anik A1 came to service. It was basically responding to the need to deliver service to the far north and other remote areas of the country. So again, the idea here that we're talking about is, again, how it helped television brought together, the key features of all of those together, telegraph, movement of film, sound, sound and private consumption aspects of radio, but it stripped people away from choice. Like, again, this is the only choices that the television was giving the audience, and it was full of advertisements, and it would, show them specific things at specific times. Now, again, all of those has changed. Now, the rise of television, old media's future. Now, with the arrival of television, there was a lot of concerns that arose with both film and radio that would disappear. Radio has since become more of a subordinate technology. So radio fell into the background in cars, at work, around the house. It was providing a kind of a background companion to people in their everyday lives. Film has adapted and advanced with widescreen product, elaborate sound, special sound effects, 3D technology, all of those. From a new media perspective, the arrival of television sits in the living rooms of North America, made TV multimedia of its, days later. So the how television was considered as a huge, remarkable achievement technically and culturally. Now, let's start with, so television was huge achievement, both from a technical and cultural perspective. So first of all, people no longer needed to go out of their house for their entertainment. The entertainment is right at my place. as they had done with movies. For movies, you had to get dressed, you had to go, you had to, buy the tickets and so on. Here with television, it's right there. Televisions allowed for personal and private interaction with the medium. So with personal, for example, you talk like you're watching a TV show, you're very excited about the TV show, you talk with your friends, maybe people of your members of your family, talking about how this episode has ended, so and so. And you know how that multimedia began to establish itself. Now there is like a morning show at like 7 a.m. and then there's the news program. So we all wait to watch the news at like 11 a.m. and there's like a children TV show at 12, maybe a soap opera. So the multimedia began to really put bases and a foundation of what it gives. The introduction of remote control brought a whole new form of interactivity. Like the idea of pressing pause, you can record things on the, VCR player and stuff like that. And then finally, the early television networks work to successfully elicit a willingness among people to sit in front of a small screen for significant chunks of time. And of course, that we can see here, this willingness carried forward to today. How many times you just open Netflix and you just leave it, even for hours on the background, so you can maybe study or work or maybe even browse your mobile phone. So today, as people still spend many hours a day in front of their screens, different kind of screens, it can be computers, phones, tablets, both at home and at work. Now, the educational aspect, same as children's and documentary features, of television were among the first areas of focus for early multimedia developers. Similarly, when the CD-ROM format emerged in the 1980s, much of that early non-network content was pretty educational. There was dictionaries, encyclopedias, science, natural material. Same like we mentioned in chapter 1, when there was CD, like the Microsoft, when they presented CD-ROMs for different topics, for example. So here, television quickly succumbed to commercial pressures. Now, it's not only, again, like we said here, it is not only about education, children, documentary anymore. We want commercial. We want to make money. So commercial pressures basically is making more money. Now, of course, making more now. If you want to apply it like now, a show like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, it's a very trivial, shallow TV show, but it's very commercial. It brings in so much money to the producers and to the advertisers. So it was simply too powerful of a tool, especially for advertising, to be just left in the hands of educators and news organizations. Like education is not going to bring them money, news is not going to bring them money, advertisers and commercial purposes will bring them money. So in order to attract as wide an audience as possible, television became gradually, the idea of vast wasteland or the idiot box that prompted writers, to the idea of manufacturing, consent, which we're going to show, a small video about it later on. So yeah, is it over here? So although, the television as an electronic device can hardly be blamed of all the ills of society, of course, it's not about the medium, but it's about how the medium is used. TV has become a shorthand for the entire collection of visual media. New media forms did not entirely displace old media. Instead, they kind of rearranged the pieces. So movie studios and radio stations were disrupted by the arrival of television. They both found new niches and new mutually compatible roles. Movie studios turned to creating content for TV. Radio adapted to focus on mobile and casual listeners, as well as finding niche, like talk radio, sports radio, and so on. That there will always, so keeping in mind that there will always be like a balancing act between old and new media forms. So there is no media form that's going to delete completely the previous media, rather than rearranging it. So there is no, it does not happen without a complete displacement. So although media forms and uses have, precursors or antecedents, new media forms, such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, they bring together, fresh behavior and affect the shape of society in new ways. Again, like the video that I want you guys to work on your class activity, with a new media emerging, how does the behavior of society also change? And finally, we have artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence basically is in the amidst of explosion, being used in the latest form of interactive media. So for example, something like chat box. The chatbots when you want to order something or talk with someone until the actual customer service comes in. So this is AI. They come in as investment strategies, home entertainment, information device, like Siri, Alexa, all of those. Now, while artificial intelligence and machine learning seems to be very new, it actually builds on a long history, going back to, the very beginning of the idea of computers, the presence of conversational interfaces. Now, artificial intelligence emerged first as a theoretical possibility, just theory. How can we have, just a computer talk back to me? Described in 1950 by computer pioneer Alan Turing, just as first as computers were being built. 20 years later, the field enjoyed the first several of explosions of interest and great optimism on the ability to recreate, this general intelligence, something similar to human intelligence using machines. There was a second AI spring that was in 1980s, that spurred, by a major Japanese investment technology called the Fifth Generation Computer Project. And the Japanese project it pushed forward computer technology on a number of fronts, especially parallel processing. With the hopes and the dreams of creating better human-like artificial intelligence programs. However, it had a lot of disappointing results. So these disappointing results, however, combined with the new easier to use alternative systems, resulted in a huge widespread of criticism in artificial intelligence and created what was the term of the AI winter, in which the many failures were thought to spell out the end of the field. Now, however, the barriers, they gradually fell and real progress started to be really made. Now, of all the major technology companies, such as, Google, Facebook, Apple, have thousands of scientists working on the problem of artificial intelligence. It will just make it, much easier for them. So here, for example, there was, a game or like a sport, I think called AlphaGo. Google's AlphaGo computer beat the world's best Go player in 2016. So again, it was something of like, we want to create something as close as possible, like I said, human-like artificial intelligence. So in other words, they programmed in the basic rules and then let the machine play against itself for, millions of times to learn what was successful and what wasn't. And, finally, the future of AI may be a field dominated by computers that program themselves and become learning partners to human. Now, of course, you see all of these ideas, of having robots, of having, different machines talking to us or machines doing our work and so on. So that is the end of chapter 2. I hope I have made this as easy as possible for you guys. I will hopefully see you on Monday tomorrow, and we will start with chapter 3. See you guys soon.